Hey y'all, Dr. Taylor back with you again. We are scooting on through Module 3, and today we're going to talk about Chapter 9. This is about document analysis in political science research. So document analysis is extremely important. This can be used in both quantitative and qualitative research. It can be used in American politics, comparative politics, international relations. Political theory is actually a type of document analysis as well. So document analysis is extremely important and a very, very useful strategy for doing research in political science, regardless of your general disposition towards certain types of research, qualitative, quantitative, or your field, American, comparative, or IR. So today we're going to talk about the written record and some advantages and disadvantages with that, and content analysis. And of course the textbook has some really great examples, talks about some measurement strategies you might use and things like that. So don't forget to read the chapter. Don't forget to look at those examples they have of various types of running record and episodic record and things of that nature. So I can't get into all that in this lecture podcast, but the book is your friend, so please read the book and keep up with everything and make sure you can do as well as you possibly can on your quizzes. All right, let's get started. So the written record includes documents, reports, and statistics, manuscripts, and other written, oral, or visual materials. This is important. The written record is everything. Written, oral, or visual. It's everything. So statistics would be things like Gallup polls, right? That's a type of running record that we have on presidential approval. Manuscripts and other things. These are things like bibliographies. These are things like biographies and news reports. That's part of the episodic record about what's going on in American politics or international politics at any given time. And so the written record is the most commonly used data source in political science. The fact is that we rely very much on government reports, on intergovernmental organization reports, on news, on surveys and data. And you want to make sure that you understand what kind of written record you're using, and you want to understand what advantages and disadvantages that running record presents for you. The written record, which can be either episodic or running record. So episodic are things that happen at intervals, that can be trusted, that can be verified, that can be used as a data source for a given point in time, whereas the running record is a more consistent, measured at timely intervals version of the same kind of data. So this is why the Gallup poll for presidential approval is a type of running record, and presidential biographies are a type of episodic record. Same news reports about presidential behavior or presidential action. Those are episodic records. The same information in a sense, but it's done in a different way. But the written record both of these are part of what we know as the written record. So when you're using the written record, sometimes you have to use what we call content analysis. And there are different ways researchers use the written record as evidence. You can extract excerpts, quotations, or examples from the written record to support an observation or relationship. So this is often very important. You can measure the number of times content appears in a document. This is a type of content analysis. And so to do this, you have to have what we call a coding scheme. And your coding scheme would then be used with documents, and so that you have some uniformity and some objectivity about collecting this empirical data from documents. And generally you need to make sure that your coding has what we call intercoder reliability. And intercoder reliability is established through some statistical tests once you have your data accumulated. And content analysis, to be quite specific with a definition, content analysis is when a researcher can take a verbal, non-quantitative document and transform it into quantitative data. And this is not, quantitative in the sense of, just knowing how often certain phrases were uttered. Or you could even code for the tone of language. You could code for the complexity of ideas. One of the things we know about Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election is that one of the best things he did from a campaign strategy point of view, though probably wasn't a campaign strategy, this is just the nature of how he communicates, is that he spoke. If you look at his speeches, if you take his extemporaneous comments and you do some content analysis on it, you'll find that Donald Trump ended up speaking something around a 9th to 10th grade reading level speech style most of the time. And that's really important, because the simpler you can say something, the more easily it is going to be understood, and the less context you need to understand it. And that's going to be a very effective communication strategy. And it was extremely effective. And so content analysis gave us that information. You just take his speeches, you measure his reading level, you put it into a Word document, and you get the Flesch-Kincaid reading level score, and it comes out like 9th, 10th grade level all the time. That's a very, very, very simple, direct, but yet helpful type of content analysis. You take a non-quantitative data, speeches on a campaign trail, and you turn it into quantitative data. And so some of the ways you do that is you could do it the way I just described, or you can select materials that are germane to the research topic, right? That's the first thing you have to do. So this, the sampling frame, and then sample the actual material to be analyzed from that sampling frame. So in my Donald Trump example, we were interested to know about how presidential candidates communicated with the electorate. And so you take all the speeches that they make, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Jill Stein, Gary Johnson, and then of course, I will say that Gary Johnson and Jill Stein were not making so many speeches that people cared about. But the point is that you take those speeches from those, because we care about how presidential candidates communicate with the electorate through speeches. Take their speeches, and you find out who had the lowest reading level of those speeches. I mean, that's how you selected the materials that were germane to your question. And you choose the recording unit. So this would be speech, right? Reading level of speeches. And so you take the whole speech, and that's your unit of analysis, and then you divide the content to standard units. So what was the Flesch-Kincaid reading score? Word can do that for you, so you put it into Word documents, and it gives you a score. But you could look for single words. How often was a word uttered? There have been word clouds that have been done about the news reports about Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And almost all the reports about Hillary Clinton had something to do with emails in the 2016 election, whereas Donald Trump was about immigration or some other things, some policy-specific stuff. But you can do that, and that's the type of content analysis. And then you define the categories of content that are going to be measured, and the topics of interest within the content. And that's really just sort of a busy way to say, what is your research topic? What question are you trying to answer? What is your dependent variable? What do you care about? What are you trying to find? And so that's how you use content analysis to generate quantitative, empirical evidence. And finally, if you wanted to, you could decide on some numerical values that will be used to code each category, each unit. So like I say, the Flesch-Kincaid reading score is a quantitative numerical value that you can use. But you could even just code it as high school education, high school reading level versus college reading level, right? So anything over 12 is college, anything below 12 is high school. But that doesn't, maybe Hillary Clinton's speeches were something around 11th grade, although they weren't. They're more college level. 14, 15 reading level would be college level. So, and so what you do is you could either put like a categorical variable on that, so high school versus college reading level, or you could use the actual value itself. It really depends on why you're trying, how you're trying to answer the question. If you just want sort of a pithy snapshot of what's happening, then maybe you don't rely on the numerical stuff. Maybe you just rely on the categorical variables. But if you really want to get down into the nitty-gritty, maybe you need these numerical values to make sense of what's happening. So as I've said, the written record can be broken down into a couple of categories. One is episodic record. So the episodic records are produced and preserved in a more casual, personal, and accidental manner, actually. So this would be diaries, correspondence, brochures, pamphlets, and other materials. And in fact, I'm going to say that this, in fact, includes newspapers and things like that, because they sort of bridge episodic versus running record, because newspapers, presuming that they have people who are consistently supposed to report on given individuals or positions within the government, they would have a more consistent view of things. So perhaps you could conceptualize that as running record, but in general also it is more episodic. These are people's impressions. So episodic is impressionistic. Episodic is less systematic than the running record. The running record is more likely to be produced by organizations and individuals. It is carefully stored and easily accessed, available for long periods of time. So this would be government, organization, or statistical records. So for instance, government reports, which are usually extremely standardized, are going to be part of the running record. Survey data is part of the running record. To some extent, if you wanted to think about newspapers as part of the running record, you probably could, right? National newspapers, thinking New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, things like that. Big organizations. And the local paper, excuse me, the local paper also could be considered a running record for the local issues. It's not going to be considered a running record for national issues, but for local issues, perhaps so. In general, there are 6 advantages of the written record when you want to think about how to gather and use data. If you're doing document analysis, what are 6 advantages to using written records for this? Well, first is it allows us to access subjects that may be difficult or impossible to research through direct personal contact. If you try to go ask presidents questions about themselves, first of all, you can't. Many of them are dead. Secondly, you could, but then we have to think, all right, you can ask questions of living presidents, but then we have to think, are they going to tell you the truth? I don't know. I'm going to go out on a limb and say no, right? They have a legacy to protect, and they're going to get. I mean, these people become president of the United States. Even President Trump is someone who is very aware of the fact that you have to be able to present a certain type of image to the world. You can't be your unbridled self and let out all your true thoughts, right? Most of the time. Although, one does wonder. The man seems to feel very comfortable saying most anything. So, but the fact is that many of people who reach that level of politics are very closed off and are able to compartmentalize very well. So it's just difficult to actually think that you could ask them questions and get legitimate, honest answers. I mean, to really like personal questions. I'm not saying they're not honest people. I think that they are. I'm not a very cynical person. But, the fact is that we're probably going to want to think about other ways to get access to information about them, and using the written record is one of those ways. Data gleaned from archival sources that is raw are usually non-reactive. So this means that once something has been put into the written record, it's there. It's not going to change based on new circumstances. We have evidence of what happened. And maybe you can see the change in the written record. Like, if that change shows up, then that must be a response of those who were involved. Like that's a human activity, not the activity of the data. So the archival sources are good because they're non-reactive. Sometimes the record has existed long enough to permit analyses of political phenomena over time. So this really happens with government records, survey data, things like that. There's no doubt at all that you can do really excellent longitudinal analysis with a written record, because presuming that the data have been collected in the same way over time, you've got a lot of really good evidence over time that shows you consistent measurement, and you can see any change there can be isolated and demonstrated to be caused by some other independent variable. You can get a larger sample size than would be possible through interviews or direct observation. This again goes back to surveys and newspaper reports, content analysis kind of stuff. You could just get so much more information through the written record than you could by trying to conduct interviews with people. Interviews that would take hours upon hours, be very in depth. It's extremely difficult. Whereas the written record allows you to just sort of gather a lot of data from a lot of different sources, do different types of content analysis, and understand a more holistic picture over time with a much larger sample size. In general, it's going to cost you a lot less money. You can do a really excellent content analysis of newspapers at your house with LexisNexis access to the Randall Library, and you can just go to town. I mean, you can do a really excellent paper using content analysis at your house, right? I mean, it's possible, as opposed to having to go interview people for this, interview people for that. I mean, that can be very, very expensive over the long term, and just physically difficult to do. And finally, the written record raises many fewer ethical issues than either first-hand observation or interviewing. If you tried to get a survey through IRB, it would go through very, very smoothly because surveys are, in general, extremely low probability of harm, and there's very little cost or harm possible to the subject. Whereas if you wanted to go interview people in a foreign country and ask about very complex political issues, and you want to interview them firsthand and you really get their personal account, that could be very challenging for them and also expensive for you and dangerous for you and dangerous for them. And so the written record, more to the point, relying on newspaper outlets or the historical record in some way to demonstrate an overtime political phenomenon, that's just going to be really safe. Again, one imagines that you're probably pretty safe in your house trying to do some content analysis, whereas if you have to go do interviews with people in Nepal, that may be difficult, or even a more complex place, thinking of somewhere like Zimbabwe or something. It could be very, very difficult if you have to go there and ask very tricky questions of people about politics, because their politics is not so great. There are, of course, with all things, disadvantages, and there are 5 disadvantages with the written record. First of all, record keepers may not preserve all pertinent materials, but may do so rather selectively. This is a problem. You're relying on humans. Humans are difficult. Humans are complex, and we don't always do right. Sometimes, as my granddaddy always says, some people have the can't help it's. And if you got the can't help it's, well, maybe you mess up a lot. And that would be a problem if you're trying to use the written record as a way to demonstrate evidence. There could be large gaps in archives. You could have years missing. You could have certain types of information missing. Right now, a lot of government records, if you want to go find out a lot about what happened during the Cold War, much of that is still classified. So that's a gap in the record. One imagines that we say, oh, that's fine. We're okay with that being a gap in the record. But it's a gap, nonetheless. And that causes problems with you trying to understand what's going on over time. Not only may the record be incomplete or selectively preserved, but it may also be inaccurate or falsified, either inadvertently, or on purpose. And this is always a problem with presidential records and things like that. People, we want to make sure that we can trust the information we're given. And so this is always a complex thing to consider when you're dealing with the written record. You have to make sure that the data you're using can be believed. You as the researcher have to believe it, and then of course you have to understand how it was collected and that the people who put it together were being honest and forthright. Number 4, some written records are unavailable to researchers. Again, I said that this happens before. Like classified information could be unavailable, so that's a gap. And then finally, you may lack a standard format because it's kept by different people. This is one of the things that makes government records in general so good, is that there's generally quite uniformity in how they're organized and collected. The same thing's true with surveys. Provided that surveys ask the same questions in the same ways over and over and over, which we'll talk more about that in the next chapter, then you should be in pretty good shape. However, when you get into diaries, newspapers as well, if we assume that newspaper reporters keep the same evidence standards for sourcing and things like that, and that newspapers don't radically change their standards over time, then you can be, for instance, it's the New York Times in 2017 is a much better organization and much more trustworthy organization than it was, say, New York Times circa 1917. That's the height of yellow journalism. That's the height of muckraking. There's all kinds of sort of market pressures on newspapers at the time to be sensationalized and to make outlandish claims that may or may not be backed up by empirical evidence on the ground if you want to actually go snoop around where reporters are doing their stories. However, today, the New York Times is much more trustworthy. It is the most trustworthy newspaper in the United States, perhaps in the world. It's the best evidencing standards, the best sourcing standards, the best editorial standards. It's just the best newspaper. Maybe The Guardian in the UK. It could be better. Der Spiegel in Germany, but the fact of the matter is that if you're working with sort of more personalized documents, that may not be the case. So diaries or autobiographies autobiographies are just trash. Do not ever use an autobiography as an example of the written record that can be trusted. Autobiographies are written by people who have something to defend. Otherwise, why would you write an autobiography? What is there to say about you if you have not done anything that's worth defending? So they have a decided point of view, and that's just not trustworthy. I just don't believe it because they wrote it themselves. Of course, they're going to say they were right. They were, somebody else was wrong because they're involved. Just silliness. All right, so that's it for content analysis. As always, we are scooting right along. I want to remind you to send me an email if you need to. I am happy to respond. I think everything's going really well. The discussion boards are up. The quizzes are going. You got your research design moving forward. Send me an email if you want to chat. We can talk by phone if you need to. We can meet in person if you're in Wilmington. And let's keep going. Chapter 10 podcast will be up shortly as well. Awesome.